I had always been drawn to abandoned places. There was something about the way history lingered in the air, in the crumbling buildings and rusting machinery, that fascinated me. It felt like walking through time, catching a glimpse of lives once lived, now forgotten. So, when I heard about Silverton, a ghost town nestled in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado, I knew I had to visit. Silverton had once been a thriving mining town during Colorado's gold and silver rush. But when the mines dried up, the town was gradually abandoned, leaving only a few relics of its past, old mining structures, dilapidated homes, and remnants of what had once been a bustling community. Today, it was a tourist attraction during the summer months. But now, in late October, it was quiet, almost forgotten. And that's exactly how I liked it. I made the trip alone. It was a 4-hour drive from my home in Denver, but I didn't mind. The winding roads that led into the San Juan Mountains offered stunning views of the rugged landscape, with towering peaks dusted in early snow. The sky was a brilliant blue, but there was a chill in the air, the kind that bites through your jacket and reminds you winter is on its way. As I neared Silverton, the road narrowed, twisting through thick pine forests and past steep cliffs. Eventually, the trees thinned, and I saw it, Silverton, sitting in the shadow of the mountains, its few remaining buildings scattered like bones across the landscape. The sight was both beautiful and eerie, the kind of place that looked as though it had been forgotten by time. I pulled into what used to be the town's main street, now just a dirt road lined with crumbling structures. My car was the only vehicle in sight, and there wasn't another person around. The silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that rattled the old, decaying buildings. As I stepped out of the car, I felt a strange heaviness in the air, like something was pressing down on me. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I grabbed my backpack and camera, locked the car, and began to explore. The first building I approached was an old saloon. Its wooden sign, faded and cracked, still hung above the entrance, though most of the letters had worn away. The windows were broken, and the door hung off its hinges, creaking in the wind. Inside, the floorboards groaned under my weight, and the air was thick with dust. Faded posters clung to the walls, advertising dances and performances from a time long gone. I wandered through the saloon for a while, snapping pictures of the old bar, the crumbling staircase that led to what I assumed had been rooms upstairs, and the empty bottles that still lined the shelves. The silence was almost suffocating, but there was a strange allure to it, a stillness that seemed to stretch beyond time itself. After about an hour, I left the saloon and moved on to the next building. It was an old general store, its windows boarded up, but the door slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges squealing in protest, and stepped inside. The shelves were still stocked with rusted tins and broken jars, and a layer of dust covered everything like a blanket. I wandered the aisles, taking pictures, when I noticed something strange. There were fresh footprints in the dust. My heart skipped a beat. I knelt down, staring at the prints. They were large, too large to be mine, and they seemed recent, no more than a few hours old. My mind raced. I hadn't seen anyone else around, and there hadn't been any other cars. Maybe someone else was exploring the town, but why hadn't I seen them? I stood up, feeling a growing sense of unease. The silence that had once been calming now felt oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around the store, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows, but there was no one. I stepped outside, the cold air biting at my face, and looked up and down the street. Still no sign of anyone. The wind had picked up, and it whistled through the buildings, creating an eerie sound that sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to keep moving. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe someone else had been here earlier and left. Either way, I wasn't about to let a few footprints spook me. As I made my way down the street, I passed by a few more buildings, an old schoolhouse, a blacksmith's shop, and what looked like a small church. I considered exploring them, but the growing sense of unease made me hesitant. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but every time I turned around, the street was empty. The sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the town. I knew I should probably head back soon, but there was one more place I wanted to explore before I left, the old mine. The mine was located just outside the main part of town, up a narrow path that wound through the hills. I'd read about it before coming. It had been the lifeblood of Silverton during its heyday. But after a series of accidents, it had been shut down, and the town had slowly died. Now, it was nothing more than a decaying structure, its entrance sealed off with rusty iron bars. As I made my way up the path, the wind grew stronger, howling through the mountains and making the trees sway. The air was colder here, and the sense of isolation was even more intense. By the time I reached the mine, the sun had nearly set, casting everything in a dim, twilight glow. The entrance to the mine loomed before me, dark and foreboding. The iron bars that once sealed it shut had rusted through in places, and I could see a small gap just wide enough for someone to slip through. I stood there for a moment, staring into the darkness beyond, debating whether or not to go inside. That's when I heard it, a whisper. Faint, but unmistakable. It seemed to come from deep within the mine, carried on the wind. My blood ran cold. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. Hello? I called out, my voice barely more than a whisper. Silence. I stood there, frozen, listening. For a moment, all I could hear was the wind, but then it came again, a soft, eerie whisper. Like someone was calling my name from the depths of the mine. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. Something wasn't right. The footprints in the store, the feeling of being watched, the whispers, it all felt wrong. I turned and started back down the path, moving quickly but trying not to run. As I made my way back into town, the sense of unease only grew stronger. The wind howled through the empty streets, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in unnatural ways. I quickened my pace, desperate to get back to my car and leave this place behind. That's when I saw him. At the far end of the street, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure. He was tall and thin, dressed in old, tattered clothes that looked like they belonged in the 1800s. His face was shadowed, but I could feel his eyes on me, watching, waiting. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Maybe it was another tourist, someone playing a prank. But as I stared at him, I knew, deep down, that wasn't the case. This wasn't a person. I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, just stood there, staring. The wind whipped around me, cold and biting, but I felt frozen in place. Then, slowly, the figure took a step forward. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the dirt road as I sprinted toward my car. The wind howled in my ears, and I could hear footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate, matching my pace. I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure right behind me, but the street was empty. I threw the door open and jumped inside, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition, but finally, the engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, spinning the tires in the dirt as I sped out of town. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw the figure standing at the edge of the town, watching me. But when I blinked, he was gone. The drive back to Denver was a blur. My mind raced, replaying everything that had happened. The whispers, the footprints, the figure in the street, it all felt like a nightmare, but I knew it had been real. When I finally made it home, I locked the doors and windows, double-checking everything before collapsing onto the couch. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure, standing in the road, waiting. I never went back to Silverton. In fact, I avoided that entire part of Colorado after that. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I had let the isolation get to me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Silverton may have been abandoned, but it wasn't empty. Something still lingered there, something ancient and malevolent, and I had come too close to becoming its next victim, and sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my window, I can still hear the whispers. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I hiked up the trail, my boots crunching against the dirt path. It was early October, and the San Juan Mountains were beautiful this time of year. The leaves had already begun to turn, creating a vibrant mix of golds and oranges across the landscape. I had taken this solo trip to escape the hustle of life, to reconnect with nature, and to push my limits a little. I loved the idea of spending a few days alone in the wilderness, away from distractions. It was supposed to be simple. I'd follow the trail up the mountain, camp out under the stars, and enjoy the serenity of it all. The trail was well marked, the weather forecast was clear, and my pack was fully stocked. I felt confident, even a little excited, as I made my way through the tall pines, the fresh scent of earth and pine needles filling my senses. I had hiked for hours without seeing another soul. That's what I wanted: peace, quiet, and solitude. But the further I went, the more I started to feel a strange sense of unease. It was subtle at first, like the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to my mind playing tricks on me. After all, I wasn't used to being out in the wild completely alone. By the time the sun started to dip behind the peaks, casting long shadows over the valley below, I decided it was time to find a place to set up camp. The air was getting cooler, and the shadows stretched out longer across the trail. I found a small clearing just off the path, far enough from the trail that I wouldn't be disturbed, but close enough that I could easily find my way back in the morning. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and sat back, watching the flames dance in the fading light. The forest around me was silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was peaceful. Until it wasn't. It started with a sound. A soft rustle in the bushes just beyond the firelight. I froze, staring into the darkness, straining my ears to catch any other noises. The wind had died down, and the only thing I could hear was the crackling of the fire and my own breathing. Probably just a deer, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease that had been creeping in since late afternoon. Nothing to worry about. I stood up and added another log to the fire, watching as the flames grew higher. Still, the sound gnawed at me. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the bushes where I'd heard the rustling. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and brush. Satisfied that I was alone, I sighed and sat back down. I wasn't one to spook easily, but something about this place was starting to get under my skin. I settled into my tent a little after midnight, the fire reduced to embers. The moment I zipped up the tent and lay back, the rustling started again. It was louder this time, more distinct, like footsteps crunching through the leaves. I sat up quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence of the night. I grabbed my flashlight again and unzipped the tent, shining it into the trees. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I sat there for a long time, listening, but all I could hear was the distant howl of the wind. My nerves were shot. I forced myself to lie back down, telling myself over and over that it was just my imagination. That's all it was, my mind playing tricks on me in the dark, unfamiliar woods. Somehow, I managed to drift off to sleep, but it wasn't a restful sleep. I kept waking up, feeling as though something was nearby, something watching me. Each time I woke, I listened for the footsteps, but there was nothing. Just silence. When the sun finally rose, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Morning light had a way of making everything seem less ominous. I packed up my gear quickly, eager to get back on the trail. As I hiked, I tried to push the events of the previous night out of my mind. But the further I went, the more that sense of unease returned. It was like the forest had shifted overnight. The trees seemed denser, the air heavier. And that feeling. The feeling of being watched. It was stronger than ever. I told myself I was just being paranoid. But when I reached a fork in the trail, something came over me. Instead of staying on the marked path, I felt an urge to explore. There was an old, overgrown trail leading off to the left. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but something about it called to me. Against my better judgment, I veered off the main path and onto the overgrown trail. The trees closed in around me as I ventured deeper into the forest. The air grew cooler, and the light seemed to dim, even though the sun was still high in the sky. As I walked, the sensation of being watched grew unbearable. I stopped several times, spinning around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever might be out there. But every time I turned, there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. Get it together, I muttered to myself. You're just being paranoid. But then I heard it again. The footsteps, they were soft at first. Just behind me, but unmistakable. Someone, or something, was following me. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. Is someone there? The footsteps stopped. I stood still, listening, my heart racing. Nothing. I started walking again, faster this time, but the moment I did, the footsteps resumed, matching my pace. I broke into a run. My heart was pounding, adrenaline surging through my veins as I raced down the narrow, overgrown path. The footsteps behind me quickened, growing louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my lungs burning, my legs aching, until I burst into a small clearing. I stopped, gasping for breath, and spun around. The footsteps had stopped. I was alone, or so I thought. I heard a rustle to my left and whipped my head around. There, just at the edge of the clearing, was a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, but as I squinted through the trees, I realized it wasn't. Not exactly. The figure was tall and thin, almost unnaturally so. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes. Its eyes were black, bottomless pits that seemed to stare right through me. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Who are you? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me with those hollow, empty eyes. I took another step back, my hands shaking. What do you want? Still, the figure didn't move. But then, slowly, it raised a hand and pointed at me. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait to find out what it wanted. I turned and bolted back the way I had come, crashing through the trees, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. The footsteps resumed, faster now, chasing me through the forest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I could do was run. Finally, after what felt like hours, I stumbled back onto the main trail. I didn't stop. I kept running until I reached a small stream. There, I collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. My legs were shaking, my lungs burning. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see the figure standing at the edge of the trail, but there was nothing. Just the quiet, peaceful forest. I sat there for a long time, trying to calm my racing heart. What had I seen? Who, or what, had been following me? I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my pack and started hiking again, this time staying firmly on the marked trail. I didn't stop until I reached the trailhead and my car. As I drove away from the San Juan Mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something terrible. Something ancient and malevolent. And as I looked in the rearview mirror one last time, I swore I saw those black, hollow eyes staring back at me from the trees. The cabin stood nestled at the edge of the Rocky Mountains, isolated, quiet, and seemingly perfect for what I needed, a break from everything. Life in the city had become overwhelming, constant noise, stress from work, and never-ending deadlines. I felt like I was suffocating, and when a friend of mine mentioned a cabin they knew of in Colorado, I didn't hesitate. It sounded like exactly what I needed. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just the crisp mountain air, the silence of nature, and time to myself. I packed lightly, brought a stack of books I'd been meaning to read, and enough food for the week. As I made the long drive up the winding mountain roads, I could already feel the tension in my shoulders easing. I couldn't wait to disconnect from everything. The cabin was simple but beautiful, with a log exterior and a stone chimney that looked like it belonged in a postcard. Surrounded by towering pine trees, it felt like the world had fallen away. The air was cool, with that clean, pine-scented freshness you can only get in the mountains. As I stood in front of the cabin, staring out over the view of the valley below, I couldn't imagine a better place to unwind. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the creak of wooden floorboards. The interior was just as rustic as the outside, worn but cozy furniture, a stone fireplace in the corner, and a few old, faded photographs on the walls. The kitchen was basic but functional, and the bedroom was small, just a bed and a dresser, but it felt like home the moment I walked in. The first couple of days were everything I hoped for. I spent hours sitting on the porch, reading, breathing in the fresh mountain air, and hiking around the nearby trails. I even tried my hand at fishing in a small creek not far from the cabin, though I wasn't exactly successful. But it didn't matter. It was peaceful, and that was all I cared about. At night, the stars came out in a way you never see in the city. The sky was a blanket of shimmering lights, and I'd stand on the porch for hours, just staring up at them. It was as if I'd found a little pocket of the world untouched by time, but after a few days, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first. The nights, once calming, started to feel eerily quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet where you start hearing things, or maybe imagining them. I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to this level of isolation, but it gnawed at me. The wind would whistle through the trees, and I could swear it sounded like whispers. Sometimes, I'd hear a rustling outside, but when I'd check, there was nothing. Just darkness. One night, about halfway through my stay, the noise started. I was sitting by the fireplace, reading, when I heard a loud thud on the roof, like something had landed heavily. I froze, listening. It wasn't an animal, this was too heavy, too deliberate. I set my book down and grabbed the flashlight, stepping out onto the porch. "Hello?" I called out, my voice feeling small in the vast darkness. The beam of the flashlight swept over the trees, illuminating nothing but shadows and branches swaying in the breeze. Another thud echoed from above. I snapped my head up, shining the light onto the roof of the cabin, but I couldn't see anything. My heart pounded in my chest. And I considered climbing up to check, but then I shook my head. What was I thinking? It was probably just a tree branch that had fallen, or maybe an animal after all. I went back inside, locking the door behind me, but my nerves were on edge. I tried to settle back into my book, but I couldn't focus. The silence felt heavy, pressing in from all sides. I stayed up late that night, sitting by the fire, listening for any more sounds. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I dozed off in the chair. The next day, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than I liked. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. During my hikes, I'd hear twigs snap behind me, but every time I looked, I saw nothing. Once, I even thought I saw movement in the trees, a dark shape slipping between the pines, but when I blinked, it was gone. By the time night fell, my sense of unease had deepened. The wind had picked up, howling through the trees, and the cabin creaked under its force. I was sitting by the fire again, trying to lose myself in the flames, when a new sound joined the wind, scratching. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling the branches against the window. But then it grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, deliberate. Like something, or someone, was scraping against the side of the cabin. My stomach twisted. I grabbed the flashlight again and stood by the window, listening. The scratching continued, slow and steady, right outside. I took a deep breath and threw open the door, shining the light around the perimeter of the cabin. Nothing. Just the trees swaying in the wind, the faint rustling of leaves. The scratching had stopped. Must be the wind, I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the anxiety that was creeping up my spine. I went back inside, locking the door once more. The fire had died down to embers. And the cabin felt darker than before, more oppressive. I sat there in silence for a long time, listening, but the scratching didn't come back. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake to some small noise, a creak in the floorboards, a gust of wind outside, a faint whisper on the air. By morning, I was exhausted. The days started to blend together after that. The peaceful feeling I had when I first arrived was gone, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Every night, the noises grew louder. Sometimes, it was the thud on the roof again, other times the scratching on the walls. I even started hearing footsteps outside, slow and heavy, crunching in the dirt around the cabin. And every time I went to investigate, there was nothing. On the fifth night, I woke to the sound of knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the front door. Knock. 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 I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. Who the hell would be out here in the middle of the night? I grabbed the flashlight, my hands trembling, and tiptoed toward the door. Hello? I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Knock. 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 I took a deep breath and swung open the door, shining the light into the night. No one was there. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the treeline. Nothing. I couldn't even hear the wind anymore. The night was unnervingly still. I was about to go back inside when I noticed something on the ground. Footprints. Big, heavy footprints leading away from the porch and into the trees. I felt my stomach drop. They weren't mine, and I hadn't had any visitors. The next morning, I packed my things. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was probably an animal or something else entirely explainable. But I couldn't ignore the way my gut twisted every time I thought about the noises. The footprints, the feeling of being watched. As I loaded my gear into the car, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. It stood there, quiet and still, just as it had when I arrived. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something unseen, was watching me from the shadows of the trees. The drive back to the city was long, but I didn't stop once. I wanted to be as far from that cabin as possible. For weeks after I returned, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even in my own apartment. I'd hear creaks in the floor, faint whispers in the night, but when I checked, there was always nothing. Eventually, the noises stopped, or maybe I just convinced myself they did. I tried to put the whole experience behind me, to tell myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind, but every once in a while, when I close my eyes at night, I hear it again. Knock. Knock. Knock, and I wonder if maybe, whatever was in that cabin, followed me home.